There is a single afternoon on a film set in Bavaria in the summer of 1962 that two of the toughest men in American cinema spent the next 17 years not talking about. What happened that afternoon was never reported by the press, never mentioned in either man's official biography, never acknowledged in the dozens of interviews both of them gave about the making of one of the most beloved adventure films in Hollywood history. It stayed buried until the night of October 9, 1979, when Charles Bronson sat down on the Tonight Show stage next to Johnny Carson, looked directly into camera one, and said something that made Steve McQueen rise out of his chair so fast that the microphone clipped to his jacket tore loose from its wire. What happened in the 90 seconds that followed has never been fully described until now. 3 security men moved toward the stage. Johnny Carson stood up from behind his own desk for the first time in 11 years of hosting to physically place himself between 2 men who, by any reasonable measure, looked like they were about to do real damage to each other on live national television. And what the audience did not understand, what nobody in that studio understood except the 2 men standing chest to chest under the studio lights, was that this was not actually about anger. This was about something that had been sitting unaddressed for 17 years, something that had started on a set in Bavaria with a script that changed, and a screen time that shrank, and a wound that neither man knew how to close. Before we go there, I want to ask something of you directly. I see in the comments every week that people who have been watching for months did not realize they weren't subscribed. Take 10 seconds right now and check. It costs nothing and it means everything to the channel. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back to where this actually started. Because before there was a Tonight Show confrontation, before there was a torn microphone, and 3 security men and Johnny Carson standing between 2 of the most physically intimidating actors in Hollywood, there was a film set outside Munich, Germany, and a young actor named Charles Bronson who had been promised something that he was not in the end going to get. The Great Escape began principal photography in June of 1962 on location in Bavaria with a cast that included some of the most magnetic screen presences of their generation, assembled into a single ensemble for what would become one of the defining adventure films of the decade. Steve McQueen was, at that point in his career, on the rise but not yet at the absolute peak of his fame. A former television star transitioning into film stardom with the specific hungry intensity of a man who understood that this was the moment that would determine the rest of his trajectory. Charles Bronson was a working actor with a strong reputation for physical authenticity and a face that directors loved because it photographed like granite, weathered and trustworthy and utterly without artifice. But he had not yet broken into the upper tier of leading men that he would eventually occupy. Both men arrived in Bavaria with expectations about what their roles would deliver. Expectations built on the scripts they had read, the conversations they had with the director John Sturges, and the particular professional calculus that every actor makes when deciding whether a part is worth the months of their life it will require. What neither man fully anticipated was the way a film production actually behaves once cameras start rolling, and the material reveals itself to be more or less compelling in practice than it appeared on paper. Steve McQueen's character, Hiltz, the so-called Cooler King, was conceived from the beginning as one of the film's central figures, and McQueen brought to the role a quality of charismatic rebellion that made every scene he appeared in feel like it was accelerating towards something. Directors and editors watching dailies began noticing what was happening on screen. The specific magnetism that cameras either capture or don't capture in a given performer, and McQueen's was being captured in a way that was, even by the standards of a strong ensemble cast, exceptional. John Sturges began making adjustments. Not dramatic ones, not betrayals of the original conception of the film, but the ordinary adjustments that happen during production when a director realizes that a particular actor is producing something on screen that deserves more attention than the script originally allocated. Scenes were extended. A subplot involving McQueen's character was developed further than originally planned. The famous motorcycle chase sequence, which would become one of the most iconic action sequences in American film history, was expanded specifically to showcase what McQueen could do, both as an actor and as the skilled motorcyclist he actually was in his private life. None of this was treachery. None of this was a conspiracy against the other actors. It was simply the ordinary mechanics of filmmaking, in which the material that is working gets more attention than the material that is working less well, and the actors whose screen presence is most magnetic in the dailies get more of the film built around them. But ordinary mechanics, however reasonable they are from a director's chair, feel very different from the perspective of an actor who watched his own role shrink in real time over the course of a production, who watched scenes he had prepared get trimmed or cut entirely, who understood, with the particular clarity that comes from being inside the experience rather than outside analyzing it, that the balance of the film he had signed on to was shifting away from him while it was still being shot. Charles Bronson understood this. He understood it the way actors always understand it, in the small daily accumulation of evidence in which scenes get called for the day, in which conversations between the director and which actors happen with what frequency, in the subtle realignment of a production's center of gravity that everyone on set can feel, even when nobody says it directly. He said nothing publicly during the production. He was a professional, and professionals do not air production grievances during the making of a film, particularly not in 1962, when the culture of the industry made such complaints both career-damaging and simply not done. But there was an afternoon, in the final weeks of shooting in Bavaria, when something happened between Bronson and McQueen that neither man ever discussed afterward. Not in interviews, not in their memoirs, not to their closest friends, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish. Wait, because what happened on that afternoon, and the 17 years of silence that followed it, is what made the night of October 9th, 1979, the explosive thing that it became. And it begins with a script page, and a hallway outside a production trailer, and two men who almost came to blows 17 years before either of them stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage. The afternoon in question took place during the final 2 weeks of principal photography in Bavaria, on a day when the production schedule called for a sequence that had originally been written with substantial material for Bronson's character, material that had, over the preceding weeks, been quietly trimmed in successive script revisions in favor of expanded material for McQueen. Bronson received the revised pages that morning. He read them in his trailer. According to the account given decades later by a script supervisor who was present on the production, and who spoke about it only after both men were gone, Bronson did not say anything when he finished reading. He simply sat for a long time, the pages on the table in front of him, and then he got up and walked toward the production office, where he intended to speak with John Sturgis directly. He did not find Sturgis in the office. He found Steve McQueen instead, standing in the hallway outside the production trailers, reviewing his own pages for the day's shooting, his motorcycle leathers already half on for the afternoon sequence. What happened next has been described in slightly different terms by the 2 or 3 people who claim to have witnessed some portion of it, but the consistent elements across every account are these. Bronson said something to McQueen about the script changes. McQueen, who was not a man inclined toward diplomatic deflection in any circumstance, said something back that was not designed to soothe the situation. Voices rose. The script supervisor, watching from a distance she described as close enough to hear tone but not exact words, said that for a moment it looked as though the two men were going to come to physical blows in the hallway, that both of them had the particular stillness in the shoulders that precedes a man deciding whether to throw the first move, and that what stopped it, what actually de-escalated the moment before it became something that would have altered the production, and possibly both men's careers, was the unexpected arrival of a third party, production assistant who came around the corner with a question about the afternoon's equipment needs, and broke the charged silence simply by being there, by being an ordinary interruption that neither man wanted to have witness whatever was about to happen. McQueen turned and walked away first. Bronson stood in the hallway for a moment longer before doing the same. Neither man spoke to the other for the remainder of the shooting day. The production assistant, according to her own account given many years later, never told anyone what she had walked into, because she did not fully understand what she had walked into. Only that the air in that hallway had been wrong in a way she had never felt on a film set before or since. The two men finished the production. They worked together professionally for the remaining scenes that required their joint appearance. The film was released in July of 1963 to enormous success, a critical and commercial triumph that established both men's careers at a new level and that has remained, in the decades since, one of the most beloved adventure films ever made. Neither man, in any interview given over the following 17 years, ever mentioned what had happened in that hallway. McQueen's career accelerated into the absolute top tier of American film stardom. Bronson's career also accelerated, more gradually but with remarkable staying power, into a different kind of stardom, one built on the specific authority of his screen presence, in roles that increasingly traded on exactly the qualities that had made him so effective in The Great Escape, even with the diminished screen time. Both men became, by the late 1970s, among the most recognizable and bankable stars in the world, and both men, for 17 years, carried something unaddressed about a hallway in Bavaria that neither one had found the words or the occasion to resolve. Until Johnny Carson, without fully understanding what he was setting in motion, decided to book them on the same night. Johnny Carson's production team had been trying to arrange a joint appearance with McQueen and Bronson for over a year, not because anyone on the staff had any awareness of the tension between them, which had never become public knowledge in any form, but simply because the pairing made obvious sense from a booking perspective. Two of the biggest stars in American film, both known for parts in the same beloved war film, both notoriously selective about television appearances, both rarely seen together in any public setting despite their shared history. When the scheduling finally aligned for the night of October 9, 1979, the production staff considered it something of a coup, a pairing that would generate exactly the kind of audience interest that made for a memorable broadcast. Neither McQueen nor Bronson, in their separate pre-show conversations with the booking producers, gave any indication that there was anything complicated about appearing together. McQueen, by 1979, was already dealing privately with the early symptoms of the illness that would eventually take his life, though this was not publicly known at the time, and would not become known for some months yet, and he had grown more selective and more guarded in his public appearances generally, a quality the press had taken to characterizing as reclusiveness, without fully understanding the medical reality underneath it. He agreed to the Tonight Show appearance for reasons that were, according to people close to him at the time, connected to a sense that his opportunities for this kind of thing were narrowing, and that there were things he wanted to say publicly while he still had the platform and the energy to say them, though nobody around him at the time fully understood the urgency behind that motivation. Bronson agreed to the appearance because his career was, in late 1979, at one of its commercial peaks, and the visibility was professionally valuable in the ordinary way that television visibility is valuable for a film star with projects to promote. Neither man mentioned the other's name with any particular weight in their separate conversations with the booking staff. If either of them was thinking about the hallway in Bavaria 17 years earlier, neither showed it to the people arranging the appearance. The broadcast began in the ordinary way that Tonight Show broadcasts began, with Carson's monologue, with the introduction of the first segment, with the studio audience settling into the particular receptive energy that a strong lineup of guests generates before anyone has even walked onto the stage. McQueen came out first to substantial applause, looking notably thinner than audiences remembered him, a fact that several members of the production staff noted privately, but that nobody understood the significance of at the time. He was warm with Carson, funny in the understated way that had always been part of his appeal, talking about a project he was developing, deflecting personal questions with the particular skill of a man who had spent 2 decades managing the boundary between his public and private selves. 20 minutes into the segment, Carson introduced the second guest. Bronson came out from behind the curtain to his own substantial applause, shook Carson's hand, and then turned to shake McQueen's hand as well. The ordinary professional courtesy of 2 actors who had worked together, appearing on the same broadcast. The handshake was brief. Several people in the production team, watching from the wings, described something in the quality of it afterward, a stiffness that registered at the time as simple unfamiliarity rather than anything more significant. The kind of thing you only notice in retrospect once you understand what came later. The conversation proceeded normally for the better part of 15 minutes. Carson asked about the Great Escape, about the experience of making it, about the motorcycle sequence that had become one of the most iconic pieces of action filmmaking in American cinema. McQueen talked about it with the particular pride of a man discussing something he knew he had done exceptionally well. Bronson talked about it too, more briefly, in the measured way that was his general public manner. And then Carson, in the ordinary course of an interviewer following an interesting thread, asked a question that he had no way of knowing was about to detonate 17 years of unaddressed history on live national television. He asked, with the genuine curiosity of someone who loved hearing behind-the-scenes stories from film sets, whether there had been any real competitiveness on the set of a film with so many strong personalities in the cast. Charles Bronson was quiet for a moment. The pause was not long, perhaps 3 seconds. But it was long enough that the people in the control room who had been watching the broadcast with the ordinary half-attention of professionals managing a routine show began paying closer attention. The specific instinct that experienced television people develop for the moment when something unscripted is about to happen. Bronson said that there had been some competitiveness, yes. Carson, sensing a good story, asked him to elaborate. And Bronson, after another pause, a longer one this time, said something that he had apparently decided, in the seconds between Carson's question and his own answer, that he was finally going to say in public after 17 years of not saying it. He said that there had been a moment during filming when he felt his role had been deliberately diminished in favor of expanding someone else's screen time, and that this had created a tension on set that had never been fully resolved between the two of them. He did not look at McQueen while he said it. He was looking at Carson, his voice level and controlled in the particular way that Bronson's voice was always level and controlled. The granite quality that made him so effective on screen, translating directly into the quality of his public speech. But everyone in the studio understood immediately who he was talking about, because there was only one other person on that stage who had been in the cast of that film, and McQueen's face, visible on the studio monitors and to the live audience in the room, had gone very still in the specific way that precedes something. Carson, sensing that he had stumbled into something larger than he had anticipated, asked Bronson directly whether he was referring to McQueen. Bronson said yes. He said it simply, without elaboration. The single syllable landing in the studio with the particular weight that a true thing carries when it has been withheld for a very long time and is finally released into a room. And then he said the thing that detonated everything. He said that he had never received an apology, or even an acknowledgement, for what had happened during the filming of that movie, and that he had carried that for 17 years because he had never found, or perhaps never allowed himself, the occasion to say it directly to the person responsible. Steve McQueen stood up. He did it fast, the chair sliding back hard enough that it nearly tipped, the microphone wire pulling taut and then tearing free from where it had been clipped to his jacket, the small device clattering against the desk. The studio audience, who had been laughing and relaxed only moments before, made a collective sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a murmur, but something in between. The sound of 300 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what kind of broadcast they were watching. McQueen's face, thin from the illness nobody yet knew about, was flushed with something that read, to everyone watching, as pure anger. He said something to Bronson that the microphones did not fully catch because his own microphone had torn loose, but that several people close enough to the stage reported hearing fragments of. Something about Bronson not knowing what actually happened on that set. Something about 17 years being a long time to wait, if it had genuinely mattered that much. He took a step toward Bronson. Bronson did not retreat. He rose from his own chair, slower than McQueen, but with the specific, deliberate quality of a man who has decided he is not going to back down from a confrontation he has, in some sense, been waiting 17 years to have. The two men were standing close enough that the studio's floor manager, watching from the wings with the specific alarm of someone responsible for the physical safety of a live broadcast, began moving toward the stage along with two security personnel who had been stationed, as a matter of routine, at the edges of the studio. Johnny Carson stood up from behind his own desk. This was, according to every person who worked on The Tonight Show during Carson's entire 30-year tenure, something that had happened perhaps a handful of times in the show's history. Because the desk was Carson's position of professional command, the place from which he managed every broadcast, and leaving it during a live segment was something he reserved for only the most extraordinary circumstances. He walked around the desk and placed himself physically between the two men, not shoving either of them, but inserting his own body into the space that had been closing between McQueen and Bronson, a calculated risk by a 63-year-old talk show host stepping between two of the most physically capable men in American cinema at the exact moment when neither of them seemed entirely certain what they were about to do. He said, in a voice that the production staff later described as carrying an authority none of them had heard from him before, "Gentlemen, not on my stage." The studio was completely silent, except for the sound of the orchestra, which had stopped playing without anyone giving a specific cue, the musicians simply sensing that the moment required silence rather than underscoring. McQueen's eyes were still on Bronson, his jaw tight, his breathing visible even from the wide shots the cameras were capturing. Bronson had not moved either, standing with the particular stillness of a man holding himself in careful check, the granite quality of his public face now serving a very different purpose than it usually served on screen. Carson said it again, quieter this time, addressing both men directly by name. "Steve, Charlie, whatever this is, it deserves better than this." McQueen looked at Carson. Something in his face shifted, the anger not disappearing but changing in quality, becoming something with more grief underneath it than the fury that had brought him out of his chair. He sat down, slowly, deliberately, the chair scraping back into position, his hands visibly shaking slightly as he reached for the water glass on the desk in front of him and drank from it without looking at anyone. Bronson sat down as well, a moment later, his own movements equally deliberate, equally controlled. The security personnel, who had reached the edge of the stage, stopped and waited, unsure whether their intervention was still needed. Carson remained standing for a moment longer, looking at both men before returning to his own chair behind the desk. The silence in the studio lasted almost 30 seconds, an eternity in live television, before Carson spoke again, his voice gentler now, the host's voice rather than the referee's voice. He asked McQueen directly what had actually happened on that set. The same question, essentially, that he had asked moments before the confrontation, but asked now into a different kind of room, a room that had just witnessed something real and was waiting, with the particular attention that follows genuine conflict, to understand what it had actually been about. Steve McQueen was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had none of the anger that had been in it minutes before. It had something else, something heavier, the quality of a man who has been carrying a misunderstanding for 17 years and is finally being given the chance to correct it, though correcting it required him to say things about himself that he had never said publicly before. He said that he had not asked for the script changes during the filming of The Great Escape. He said that he had not gone to John Sturgis, had not lobbied for more screen time, had not done anything to engineer the expansion of his own role at Bronson's expense. He said that what had happened on that production, the gradual shift in the balance of the film toward his character, had been the director's decision entirely, made for reasons that had nothing to do with anything McQueen had requested or maneuvered for. He looked at Bronson directly for the first time since standing up. He said, "I never went after anybody's screen time, Charlie. I never even knew exactly what was happening until the dailies started coming back, different than the script we'd both read. And I should have said something to you about it then. I should have come and found you and told you I didn't ask for it. I didn't know how." Bronson was quiet. The studio waited. McQueen continued, his voice lower now, more difficult to hear, the studio leaning in collectively to catch what he was saying. He said that he remembered the hallway. He said it directly, using exactly those words, the hallway, and the recognition that passed through the room in that moment. The understanding that both men were referring to a specific shared memory that had never before been spoken about publicly was visible in the stillness that followed. He said that he had thought about that afternoon more than Bronson probably realized, that it had stayed with him in a way that the surface of his career, The success and the magazine covers and the box office numbers had never fully covered over. He said that he had told himself, in the years since, that there would be a right time to address it. A natural opening, a moment when it would make sense to bring it up without it seeming strange or overly serious. He said that the right moment had never come, because that is generally how it works with things you are afraid to say. The right moment keeps not arriving, because you keep deciding it isn't quite the right moment, until 17 years pass and the thing is still sitting there, unaddressed, taking up more space in your private accounting of your own life than it should have been allowed to take. He said, "I'm sorry, Charlie. Not for the screen time. I didn't take that from you on purpose. I'm sorry I never came and told you that. I let you carry something for 17 years that I could have put down for you in a 5-minute conversation, and I didn't, because I didn't know how to start it." Charles Bronson sat with this for a long moment. His face, the granite face that had made him one of the most recognizable actors in the world, was doing something that very few people had ever seen it do in public, which was showing, without any attempt at control or management, the actual feeling underneath it. He said quietly, "I always wondered if you knew." McQueen said, "I know now what I should have known then." Bronson nodded slowly. He said that he had not come on the show intending to say what he had said. He said that something about sitting next to McQueen again, after all the years, after watching how thin he looked, after some instinct he couldn't fully name, had made him decide in the moment that if he didn't say it now, he might never have another occasion to say it at all. He did not know when he said this how close to true that statement actually was, how little time Steve McQueen actually had left, though something in the quality of his own intuition that night suggests he may have sensed more than he consciously understood. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Bronson extended his hand, not the brief professional handshake from the beginning of the segment, but something different, held longer. Both men's grip visibly firmer, the specific quality of a handshake between two people who have just put down something heavy that they had both been carrying separately for a very long time, without either one knowing the other was carrying it too. The studio audience erupted into applause that lasted, according to the production team's own count, for almost 2 full minutes, an unusually long response even by the standards of an emotional Tonight Show moment. Johnny Carson did not try to move the broadcast along during it. He sat behind his desk and let the room have its response, understanding, with the particular instinct that had made him the best in his field for nearly 2 decades, that what had just happened deserved to be witnessed fully rather than managed efficiently into the next segment. When the applause finally settled, Carson asked both men gently whether they wanted to talk further about it, or whether they would rather move on to lighter material. Bronson said that he thought they had said what needed saying. McQueen agreed. The remainder of the broadcast proceeded in a register that was different from how it had begun. Warmer, looser, both men visibly more at ease with each other than they had been even before the confrontation. The specific lightness that follows genuine resolution rather than avoided conflict. They told stories about the Great Escape production that had nothing to do with the tension between them. The ordinary anecdotes of a film set populated with strong personalities. And the laughter in those stories had a different quality than the laughter earlier in the broadcast. Easier, more genuine. The laughter of two people who no longer had something unaddressed, sitting underneath everything else they said to each other. NBC's switchboard was overwhelmed for the remainder of the night. The clips of the confrontation and the resolution that followed it were replayed and discussed for weeks afterward, becoming one of the most talked about moments in the show's recent history, not because of the conflict itself, but because of what the conflict revealed about how long two people can carry something unspoken, and how much lighter both of them seemed once it had finally been said out loud, on camera, in front of millions of people, after 17 years of silence that neither of them had fully understood the weight of until it was finally set down. Steve McQueen died on November 7, 1980, just over a year after that broadcast, from complications related to the cancer that had been progressing privately during the months before and after his Tonight Show appearance. Charles Bronson, when reached for comment by a reporter shortly after McQueen's death, gave a brief statement that referenced the broadcast directly. He said that he was grateful, more grateful than he could properly express, that the two of them had found a way to say what needed saying, while there was still time for it to matter. That he had thought about how differently he would have carried McQueen's death if the 17 years of silence had still been unresolved between them, if he had been left to grieve a friend with whom he had never managed to close the distance that had opened between them in a hallway in Bavaria so many years before. He said that the confrontation on Carson's stage, frightening as it had looked in the moment, had been the best thing that happened to either of them in years, because it had given both of them back something they had not realized they had lost, which was the ability to be honest with each other, without the years of accumulated unspoken weight standing in the way. Johnny Carson, in a later interview reflecting on memorable moments from his decades hosting the show, cited the McQueen and Bronson broadcast as one of the most significant nights in the program's history, not because of the drama of the confrontation itself, but because of what it demonstrated about the value of saying the difficult thing before it becomes too late to say it. He said that he had stood between two of the toughest men in Hollywood that night, fully uncertain whether he was about to witness something he would regret being responsible for, and that what he had actually witnessed instead, watching it unfold from that closer vantage point than anyone else in the building, was two men finally putting down something they had both been carrying alone for far too long. If this story moved you, there is something I want to ask you to consider. If there is a person in your life with whom something has gone unaddressed for years, a hallway you have both been avoiding the memory of, a misunderstanding that has calcified into distance simply because neither of you found the right moment to address it, do not wait 17 years. Do not wait for a stage and an audience and a question you weren't expecting to force the issue into the open. Find the moment yourself. Say the thing. The relief on the other side of saying it is almost always larger than the fear of saying it. Please consider joining this channel's community if you have not already. The link to become a member is below, and joining helps make these stories possible. Please like this video if it stayed with you, because it helps more people find these stories when they need them. Subscribe so the next one reaches you, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And is there something you have been carrying that you have not yet found the moment to say? Maybe tonight is the night you stop waiting for the right moment and just say it.